Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to create a gun. And we're going to learn how we're going to be architecting guns for this game so that they are swappable, so that we can have different properties on different types of guns. And that's generally how the architectures work in shooters, first person or third. Let's dive in and see how it's done. Okay, so we haven't checked in on our project plan in a little while. Where have we got to? The player movement is done. The animation, for now, it's done. And the shooting, that is the next thing for us to focus on. Now, it's a little confusing here because our mesh already appears to have a gun. But actually, we don't want to use this gun. We want to use it in a different way. Reason being, in a shooter type of game, you often want to be able to switch between weapons, or at least be able to have different characters have different weapons. And the easiest way to do that is to architect the gun as a separate thing to the character so that you can swap them out so that it can be responsible for how it shoots. If it's a rocket launcher or a shotgun or a rifle, they're going to do things in different ways. Now, you might say, okay, well, let's create a gun component, and we can stick that gun component underneath our mesh. That would work, except that then we lose the modularity that allows us to add multiple components to the gun. So what we really want to do is go down the route of having an actor for the gun that is childed to the shooter character. Now, this is something we haven't come across before, but it works like this. You can have a shooter character and a gun as its child, and the shooter character can have multiple components which are childed to each other. So you've got the capsule, we've got the mesh as a child of the capsule at the moment. And the components of the gun can be childed to that. So the mesh gets childed to the mesh of the character, and if it's got any other components, such as maybe a particle effect at the muzzle of the gun, that might be childed to the mesh. So you can see that these hierarchies are kind of independent, that you've got the scene components, the ones that have transforms, over on the right, and they can be in a certain hierarchy. And then the actor hierarchy actually follows the hierarchy of the scene components. The actors don't have a hierarchy of their own. This is the bit that takes a little bit of time to get your head around, and was a aha moment when it clicked for me, is that in actual fact, there is no hierarchy of actors. There's only a hierarchy of scene components. There are actors that own the scene components, and so they end up having a hierarchy because their scene components are related to each other, but they don't actually have a relationship among themselves. So with that said, to set the context, the first thing we want to go and do is actually create ourselves a C++ gun actor. And in this case, it's not going to be a pawn or character or anything like that. It's just going to be a straightforward actor because we don't need any behavior. We don't need to possess it. We don't need to do anything. It's just a simple actor. So let's go ahead and do that. In fact, a little challenge for you. Go ahead and create that C++ actor. It's something you should be able to do. Little mini challenge. Attempt it. Okay, and back in, I'm going to go and do it. New C++ class, and we don't need to have, let's see, actor. That's the one we want to choose. And we're going to go ahead and call this one gun. Simple as. Let's create that class. Okay, and once that's done, it's going to pop up in your code editor, and we don't need to do anything with it just yet because the first thing I want to do is create a blueprint subclass. So right click on your class in the content browser, and instead of calling it my gun, I don't know why it automatically defaults that, BP underscore gun. I'm going to put it at the root of content for now. We can do a bit of reorganizing once we've got more classes, as I've said before. We'll create the blueprint class. As you can see, it's completely empty. It's got this default scene root. We're going to want to fix that up. What we want to do is actually add a component in C++ because this is a C++ course. Let's practice the muscle of adding components in C++. It also means that we're going to have access to those components from within our C++ code to manipulate and write our code there. Now, the setup we're going to want is to have a scene root component, which is just going to be a scene component, and then a mesh that's a child of that. Why do we want that? Because we want to be able to change the position of the mesh relative to the root of the gun, so that we can basically place the handle in different locations for different meshes. So if we have different guns, we can make sure they all have the handle in the same place so that when we attach it to the character's hand, it's going to appear with the handle in the character's hand. Okay, so how we're going to do that, we're going to go over to our Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to create a private section down here where we're going to store the U properties for the different components that we're going to come up with. So I'm going to create a U property visible anywhere. We want our components to be visible anywhere because they're pointers. We don't want to be able to edit the pointers, but we do want to be able to see the properties of those pointers and be able to edit those. And that then becomes the purview of the class that we're pointing to. That then decides what gets shown, what is editable. So all we want to say here is that it's not the pointer that is editable. So that's why we're going for visible anywhere. Anyway, a little bit of revision there. Now we want this to be a U because it's a component, then it's a scene component that we're wanting. If I can type it correctly, scene component, and it's a pointer to it, and this is going to be our root component, like so. And then we're going to want a U property, again, visible anywhere, for our mesh. Now the class for the mesh is going to be a U static mesh component because this isn't a skeletal mesh, it's rigid, it doesn't have any skeleton, any bones, so I want that to be a pointer, and this we're just going to call the mesh like so. In fact, I think I need to be a little bit careful here because I think root component already exists in the parent class for actor, so I'm just going to call this root instead. And then we've already got a constructor over in the C++. We're just going to need to include the appropriate header files here. Now, a little trick when you're in Visual Studio Code is to find out where a header file might be. You use Control-P, and you're going to search for, in this case, we want to know the static mesh, so static mesh component. And we can see that the static mesh component.h, if I go ahead and open it up and hover over the tab, you can see that it is under this long path, but the bit that's interesting is that it's under classes, which then we can look up from there. It's going to be components, static mesh component. So I can close that tab down, and just above our include, in fact, below the include for our gun, we're going to do a hash include for the components, and then the static mesh component. Now, actually, I've just remembered that the meshes that we've got, for some reason, aren't actually static meshes. I believe they might be skeletal meshes. You can find this out by going into the asset packs, shooter game, weapons, and having a look at these meshes. And sure enough, if you hover over them, you can see that they are skeletal meshes. Don't ask me why. For some reason, that's what they are. So we're going to want to change the type to skeletal mesh in the header file. So instead of the U static mesh, it's going to be U skeletal mesh instead. And same for the include, it's going to be the skeletal mesh component.h that we want. Remember, there's no U in the header files. And I believe the scene component is already included here by default. So it's time for a challenge to add a mesh component of your own. We're going to create a root scene component, set it to the root, and set it to the root for the class, and create a mesh component and set up the attachment between the two so that the mesh component is a child of that root scene component. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to go over and set, first of all, our root. It's going to be a create default sub-object of type uSceneComponent. And then we are going to give it a name, which is going to be with the text macro. We're going to call it the root and finish off with a semicolon. Then we're going to set it as the root. So set root component, we'll set it as the root component for the actor. So set root as the root component. Good stuff. Then we're going to want to create our mesh. So mesh equals create default sub-object, and it's the U skeletal mesh component that we want as the class, and then the text macro for, just going to call it mesh and add a semicolon on the end there. Then we want to set up attachment, so it's going to be mesh arrow setup attachment, and we're going to want to attach to the root like so. Cool stuff. So we can go ahead and save that and hopefully compile and build. And we'll go over into Unreal and have a look at our child class. And sure enough, in here, we've got ourselves the root, we've got the sub mesh, We've also got this default scene root which is hanging around. I think let's restart the editor and see if that just goes away. Sometimes when adding components, things can linger around like that and get cached. And sure enough, if we open up the BP gun blueprint again, you can see that we've just got those two components we've added, the root and the mesh, and we probably want to go ahead and change out the mesh for one of the skeletal meshes from the asset packs from the shooter game. We've got a rifle, we've got a launcher. I'm going to choose this one to be the rifle. So actually calling it a BP gun is a little bit disingenuous. This should probably be the BP rifle. So let's go ahead and rename that. Go over to the content browser and rename it to BP rifle or BP gun underscore rifle. No, we'll call it BP rifle directly. There you go. And that has given us a gun. Now, obviously, now this means that we can have all sorts of properties against this actor, such as the strength of the weapon, its range, and so on and so forth, by creating new properties in C++. And that is the strength of having this architecture, is that the guns can then be a little bit different. We can have different shooting mechanics for rifles versus snipers versus RPGs, things like that. So that's great. And we can also have different stats. So we can have a strong rifle and a weak rifle, depending on different blueprint subclasses. Cool stuff. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look at how we're going to actually spawn this gun as a child of our current character. I'll see you there.